Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Prelude to Mayhem by Edward Aubry. Narrated by C.S.E. Cooney. Part 1. Intersubstantial. Chapter 1. Harrison. Around the time his car reached 90 miles an hour, Harrison closed his eyes. The road curved in front of him, and he steered from memory. Late on a weekday afternoon, I-91 might once have been crowded with traffic, but other cars were no longer a hazard. He pushed in the clutch and waited for the car to coast to a stop. The sense of motion diminished. By the time the speedometer dropped to 0, he had opened his eyes to survey the scraps of twisted iron and concrete rubble composing the ruins of the Holyoke Mall parking garage. The car had come to rest on the shoulder of an exit ramp overgrown with sunflowers, about a half-mile shy of the mall. Other than the parking garage, the mall was intact, at least on the outside. Inside, though, previous expeditions revealed things had fallen into chaos. No shops, no merchandise, no restaurants. All now empty lot after empty lot. Up near the skylights, local flora ran rampant. Trekking over the embankment and around the bend in the mall parking lot driveway, Harrison headed for his destination in one of the satellite buildings, the Barnes & Noble. On his last visit he had picked up a copy of The Great Gatsby, for which he had left a $10 bill on the counter. The gesture was pointless, other than to maintain the illusion of normality. He planned to leave more money today, in exchange for a copy of Tom Sawyer. As he made his way to the empty parking lot, he glanced over at the vast field of sunflowers 100 yards away. Some of the enormous blossoms had risen from their natural droopy state and tracked his movement. The first time, the entire field, an easy 50,000, silently scrutinized his behavior. Now fewer than 50 tracked him, evidence of his predictability. "Nothing to see here," he shouted in their direction. Several flopped back down. The rest continued to watch. Harrison stood just over 6 feet tall, and in the time since he had lost all concern about his personal appearance, his dark brown hair had grown long and unkempt. A good shave was a rarity that cycled back once every 2 weeks, and he was due. Clad in a short-sleeve plaid shirt, unbuttoned over a Pink Floyd t-shirt and a pair of cut-off jeans, he took an odd satisfaction in the scruffy look, a badge of his having walked away from his day job forever. At the edge of the parking lot, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. A large, dark lump lay in the dirt before him. "Damn, another one," he whispered. Closer to it, he could make out the pebbly skin and the beginnings of that god-awful smell. Including this one, he had found 6 dead dinosaurs in 10 weeks. While he had yet to see a live one, he felt neither surprise nor disappointment on that count. It made perfect sense these displaced creatures would not live long in such a random environment. If the dinosaurs had all come into the world at the same time, when everything else changed, they must have been dying off. He reached into his breast pocket and removed a small plastic clamshell case. Inside lay a pair of sleek, dark glasses, which he unfolded and put on. The lenses darkened in response to the sun, although no more than an hour remained until dusk. Harrison tapped the edge of the glasses. A 3-dimensional display appeared in the air about 3 feet in front of his face. It provided him with the date, time, temperature, relative humidity, mean barometric pressure, and wind speed. It also included a readout for wind direction, but for reasons unknown, it had only ever given him error messages. The display was an illusion, a tiny hologram projected onto his retina. He knew from experimenting, he had mounted them on a mannequin head once, an outside observer would see nothing but a man tapping his glasses. He tapped them twice more, and cycled through 2 categories of data until the word infrared appeared. The fallen beast showed no deviation from the ambient temperature. That might mean a corpse, or it might mark it a cold-blooded animal. He tapped twice more to bring up a passive sonar display overlaid against the natural background. Birds, small rodents, and insects showed faint blips as they pinged away in their native tongues. The dinosaurs showed nothing. Dead for certain, then. A live animal, and a large one at that, would give a visible heartbeat. He removed the glasses and moved closer. From his angle he could only see the dinosaur's back, notable for its lack of adornment. Of the ones he had seen so far, all were equipped with some sort of armor or horns, except for the gigantic sauropod, which smelled far too horrible for any sort of close inspection. None had been species he recognized from his boyhood dinosaur phase. As he closed in on this one, its distinguishing features became clearer. Blood drained from his face as he took them in. The powerful hind legs and short forelegs, the huge head, even the claws he was able to observe with some degree of detachment. But oh God, the teeth, like big bone knives. A predator. His first instinct was to flee back to the road, back to the car, back to the 90 miles an hour. He had been sure somehow none of the dinosaurs would be carnivores. Now all bets were off. Of course, the presence of one did not necessitate the presence of more. He had never seen more than one example of any species. Maybe they couldn't survive alone, and if herds now roamed these lands, he surely would have encountered one by now. But then he had been certain there were no predators, and here lay one that had stayed alive for 10 weeks, eating something. 5 minutes later, he sped down the road at 90 miles an hour, his eyes wide open. Chapter 2. Dorothy. Engrossed in an ACT practice test, Dorothy had no sense of the coming rain until she heard the thunder. It both startled her and called her to action. Oh. She looked up and out the wall of glass beside her. The parking lot in front of the Hallmark store she called home was still clearly dry, but the overcast sky had grown darker than it should be for this early in the evening. She took a moment to pause her timer and climbed down from the stool she had set up behind the sales counter. Donning a yellow raincoat from a coat tree near the front door, she made her way to the stockroom and out the back door, taking care to prop it open behind her. A milk crate sat on the pavement next to the dumpster. She stepped onto it to give herself enough height to flip the lid up and over without straining. It crashed down with a satisfying bang. The cardboard recycling bin had sliding side doors, and she pulled those closed as well. As the second one clanged shut, the first drop of moisture hit her nose. She pulled her rain hood over her head before dashing back inside. Dorothy washed her hands at the bathroom sink. Handling garbage can lids still felt icky. The warm water flowed over her skin, providing a sense of comfort and security. She shut off the tap before pulling a comb through her straight blonde hair, still tidy, but starting to get long enough she would normally have it cut. Whether she would choose to attempt that herself was still an open question. She took a moment to remove and polish her thick eyeglasses with the handkerchief hanging from a hook on the bathroom wall, and headed back to her test. After pulling up her stool, she picked up the timer, which had less than 2 minutes left. She sighed, cleared it, and set it down. A flash of lightning momentarily lit up the room, and the pit-pat of raindrops hitting the roof kicked in. A few seconds later, the rumble of thunder followed. Dorothy congratulated herself on getting the trash bins sealed in time, although she really had no way of knowing if her strategy of keeping the garbage dry would truly reduce the smell, nor how long that would be effective even if it did. In truth, everything about the way she managed her environment was guesswork. She had only turned 14 a month before the world as she knew it came to an abrupt halt, with herself the lone apparent survivor. Dorothy had never once gone camping before, let alone acquired any survivalist skills. And yet, here she was. She flipped to the answer key in her ACT prep book and began scoring the test. As an intellectual exercise, it moderately satisfied her, but it would never replace school. She really needed to find a proper bookstore. The ACT book had been a lucky find in the Hallmark store break room. Some college-bound employee hoping for his or her best shot at a good school had brought it into work on the day he or she had disappeared without warning, educational goals unfulfilled. Dorothy was sincerely grateful for the accidental gift, but would cheerfully have traded it in for a copy of Wuthering Heights or a chemistry textbook, or anything she could use to learn something. As if to drive that point home for her, she finished scoring the practice test with a composite score of 35. 1 point below the absolute maximum and better than 99.7% of students who took the test. Her third practice test, and her third 35. With only a 9th grade education under her belt, she was measurably college-ready. If only there were still colleges, she would be all set. A packet of beef jerky sat on the counter next to her book, and she absent-mindedly dipped her hand into it, pulling out the last morsel and a silica gel pack. She tossed the silica gel and the empty packet in the trash and popped the final scrap of jerky in her mouth, where she drew the salty, savory experience out as long as she could. The end of the jerky brought her back from fantasies of higher education, back into her current reality. She still had food, but provisions were running low. Tomorrow would have to be another supply run. The hike to Dorothy's supply station took roughly 90 minutes. She got an early start to beat the heat, but found the ground still moist from the previous night's rain, and as the sun climbed, that translated into uncomfortable humidity. She pulled one of 2 water bottles from her knapsack and downed the last swallow less than halfway to her goal. The second bottle was for the walk back, so she would just have to not be thirsty for the rest of the hike there. 4 ribbons, each a different color, hung from a tree in front of her. She paused to inspect them. Though still distinct, the sun had done a good job of bleaching them over the past month. Soon they would all fade to white, and she would need to replace them before that happened. This was the last tree to harbor all 4 colors. Blue and green diverged from here, splitting off in separate directions leading to clothing and medicine. Red and yellow continued along together until they split up to follow trails leading to food and, the least visited area, bowling. Of the 4 locations, the one with food was, unfortunately, entirely unsuitable for human occupancy. It was a small neighborhood grocery store, with a huge section of outer wall missing, exposing it to the elements. The inside provided adequate shelter from rain, but she needed better protection from the cold and from whatever predators might be roaming the earth. Of the other 3 locations, Dorothy's choice to settle into the Hallmark store as her home base was born not only of its creature comforts, but also its proximity to a hardware store in the same strip mall. Several appliances once for sale there remained connected and functional, and the decision came down to laundry. Much easier to spend the day hiking to fill a knapsack with supplies than to drag a duffel bag of dirty clothes 4 miles each way. Toward the end of her journey, red and yellow parted as well. The final 2-color tree landmark put her about 10 minutes out from her destination. She followed the red, rapidly becoming pink, ribbons, visible every 20 yards or so, though in truth she had essentially memorized the route. The ribbons would stay, however, and she would replace them with ones easier to spot. As much as she didn't need them now, at some point the Wisconsin winter would come, and these woods would look unfamiliar under a blanket of snow. Her quarry at last came into view. The shop stood alone in a small clearing, its outer walls ragged, as if wrenched away from whatever larger urban structure it had been part of. Dorothy approached cautiously, mindful of scavengers. On her first visit to this store, she had pulled all the fresh meats and deli foods, too spoiled for her to eat, and thrown them into the woods for any animals who took an interest. Evidently the locals had gratefully received her gift, as none of it remained when she returned for her second supply run. She never saw whatever ate it, and without the benefit of a thank-you note she had no way of knowing what sorts of critters she had made happy or encouraged to return for more. Seeing no animals outside, she ventured in. Here she did find fauna. The rainbow rats had returned, scurrying about with varying degrees of purpose. At least 3 dozen meandered about her, each one a different bright and solid color, for all the world like a giant comical box of rodent-shaped crayons. "Git!" she shouted, waving her arms. "Go on, shoo!" Most looked up at the noise, and then all of them bolted gracelessly into various hidey-holes among the shelves of canned goods, chittering and squeaking. A lavender rat zipped right past her feet, and as she leapt backward reflexively to avoid it, it fled through a gnawed-out hole in the bottom of the office door. It took a second for the significance of that to register. Oh no, 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 no! She scrambled to the door and threw it open, realizing a fraction of a second too late a likely sight behind it could be a multicolored army of rats prepared to defend their base. What greeted her was actually worse. Dozens of boxes of breakfast cereal Dorothy had painstakingly moved and organized into this room lay strewn about the floor, covered in paper flakes that had been gnawed out of them. She picked up the closest box and shook it. A handful of loose Cheerios rattled, some exiting through a chewed hole. Boxes of pasta, bags of rice, and assorted other dry goods had been similarly violated. A quick spot check confirmed a few containers had survived, but only a small fraction of what she thought until now she had safely squirreled away. Tears rolled down her cheeks as one by one she pulled boxes from their resting places on the desk, the utility shelves, and in most cases the floor. She summarily inspected each and either threw them onto the heap in the center of the room or stacked them in the minuscule salvageable pile. Several packets of jerky had survived the rats' rampage, though not for their lack of effort. Bite marks scarred the still-sealed packages, indicating the rats had simply chosen the path of least resistance in their gathering. She stuffed these packets into her knapsack, taking a moment to tear one open in a weak attempt to distract herself with food. As soon as she started chewing, the sobs came. She gave in to them, curling up in a ball on the floor. Chapter 3. Claudia. On his way north, Harrison fumbled through a box of cassettes in the passenger seat. Mozart's clarinet concerto trickled from the speakers in a manner altogether too relaxing for his frame of mind. He settled on a tape by a band named the Treadles and popped it into the deck. He had never heard of the Treadles, which stood to reason since none of the members had been born yet. In all likelihood, they never would be. The cassette showed a copyright notice from 2031, which put it 27 years into the future. The fact cassettes, already long obsolete by 2004, had somehow managed to survive as viable commercial products implied the Treadles might not even be from Harrison's future. Maybe they came from some other parallel one. In either case, it was a future no longer likely to happen. In the 3 months since everyone Harrison had ever known, and every trace of civilization flashed out of existence, he had not come across any other survivors. The destruction was random, leaving behind fragments of building and roads, but devastatingly comprehensive. Harrison initially assumed the world had come to an end. Perhaps some sort of doomsday weapon had finally been put to use. but discoveries like future music, dinosaurs, and sentient sunflowers complicated the model. It wasn't an ending. It was a bizarre, colossal shuffling, and Harrison's life went on. An enormous sign on the side of the road offered the irrelevant sentiment, "Welcome to Vermont." The landmark meant he had about 40 miles to go before I-91 came to an abrupt end at the bottom of a steep, tall rock. Some days he would drive right up to the base of that cliff, stop, turn around, and head back. With little else to keep him occupied, driving the length of I-91 had become a favorite outing as of late. Not much of it remained. It stretched from the cliff face in Vermont to a point a half-mile or so north of where New Haven, Connecticut used to be, where the road plunged into the ground, overgrown by brush. Some days he would explore a side road, all the exit ramps still pulled away from the highway under helpful signs, although most of them now led to nothing, or roads that went no more than 2 miles in any direction, terminating in dead ends and more forest. He did luck into the occasional gas station, and the music store where he acquired the Mozart and the Treadles. He had also found the ruins of a small apartment building, unsuitable for habitation, and a coffee shop overrun by bugs. His greatest find, a motel with a single intact room, became his residence. Otherwise, the highway offered many exits to nowhere. The Treadles tape did not improve his mood. He hit eject and caught the intro to "Here Comes the Sun" by the Beatles. Perfect. As he put the rejected tape back into its case, he began to sing along. Thoughts of his next move troubled and eluded him. He often considered how it would feel to drive right into that Vermont rock at top speed. His newfound fear of carnivorous dinosaurs provided a point in favor of that choice. Better that than being eaten. Of course, better eaten than not quite killed in a terrible wreck, with no hope of rescue, in a world without hospitals. In the middle of his morbid line of thought, the song entered its bridge. He sang along at top volume. When it finally registered, he should have been hearing nothing. The song was coming from the radio. He stopped singing. It would have been difficult to continue over the din of his heartbeat anyway. Aware of safety concerns for the first time in a long while, he focused on the drive. A radio station existed and transmitted. Logically, then, that station had an operator. Another person had survived. Despite what he had already seen, there must have been something left of Springfield or maybe Hartford that included a radio tower. The trip across the Vermont border ruled out Hartford as too far away for adequate reception. That left Springfield, which he could reach in about an hour if he turned around and hightailed it. If he decided he wanted to. Halfway through his attempt to concoct a search plan, the song ended. "Hi," said a female voice on the radio. He turned it up, hand trembling. "Hi." His throat tightened. Moisture nagged at the outer edges of his eyes. "You're still listening to Claudia. That was 'Here Comes the Sun' by the Beatles. I'd like to take a moment to repeat my message for anyone listening who hasn't heard it yet. This is an open invitation for any survivors to meet me here in Chicago." Harrison missed the next sentence, drowned out by the scream of his tires against the pavement. The seatbelt locked and bit into his chest. Further instructions. "I'll be broadcasting until midnight, Eastern Daylight Time, for those of you still keeping track. Remember, come to Chicago. Tell your friends." The initial chords of a Fleetwood Mac song whose title Harrison could not recall followed. He sat motionless, absorbing both the music and the new, life-changing information. "Chicago," he said, "is 1,000 miles away." It took him about a half an hour to get to the motel near the former location of Northampton, Massachusetts. The whole way there he listened to Claudia. She presented a selection of pop songs from the 60s and 70s to which he sang along. A song still on his lips, he pulled into the motel parking lot. Harrison killed the engine, his hand lingering on the ignition. After a brief pause, he continued the motion one click back to start the radio again. He sat there for 4 more songs before yielding to the desire for the comforts of home. He emerged from his car as a plume of teal light shot straight up from a pine tree 10 feet from the building. It left a vertical trail that extended several hundred feet. After a few seconds, the trail dissipated into tiny sparks that bounced around at random and fizzled out to nothing. "Good one," Harrison said to the tree. This light show presented itself almost every day, and the color varied. He let himself into his motel room, chained the door, and sat on the bed. For the first time since he had moved in, he turned on the television. Finding snow on every channel, he turned it off again. So much for that hunch. The alarm clock radio did not work, a detail he had noticed his first day but never missed before now. For a moment he entertained the idea of a whole night spent in his car. Then he thought about dinosaurs and opted for the bed. He had a beer. He tried to sleep. About 2 a.m. he rolled out of bed and turned on the light, covering his eyes against the sudden brightness. He groaned and sighed, having reached a state of paradox, too anxious to sleep, too depressed to stay awake. And so he planned his journey. Using a piece of the motel stationery, he sketched a map of the continental United States. Even in his crude rendering, the distance looked imposing. 1,000 miles. With the only road of any length yet discovered being the north-south I-91, he would likely be conducting most of this journey on foot. The trek might be dangerous, but there was no way he would sit on his hands in a comfy motel room while whatever was left of humanity congregated in Chicago. Preparations took the form of a bulleted list. First item, travel time. Given optimum walking conditions, he should be able to maintain a speed of 4 miles per hour. He budgeted himself 10 walking hours per day, giving him an advancement rate of 40 miles per day. 1,000 divided by 40 was 25. 25 days. If he left the next day, he would be there in just under a month. His crude map showed an empty swath of land where he would spend that month. Unexplored territory. Everything was the frontier again. In an area roughly analogous to New York State, he scrawled, "Here be dragons." Next bullet point, food. He had been surviving on snack foods and canned products. A month's provisions under current conditions could well amount to 75 cans of SpaghettiOs and a spoon. Not doable, but he felt he could reasonably expect to continue to find ruins of stores as he explored westward. Somewhere in there, the task of organizing finally brought his anxiety level down to the point where his exhaustion took over. His last thought, before the stress of the day overtook his desire to stay awake, involved gratitude. No one could see how little he knew what he was doing. Chapter 4. John. The salvageable dry goods almost all fit into 14 plastic grocery bags. Dorothy double-bagged each one, then threaded more bags through the handles to tie them together into bundles of 7. Each bundle was light enough to carry with one hand, but voluminous enough to be absurdly cumbersome. The journey back home took several hours. Dorothy needed frequent rest stops to clear the strain on her hands. The awkward burden of carrying the bundles through the woods resulted in a few stumbles, and at one point, one of the bags tore open, requiring some time to re-secure the food. In addition to those challenges, She also carried a backpack laden with canned meat, vegetables, and soups, as she did not want to make a second trip the next day.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?